Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're at. My name is Jasmine Knighton. I am one of the optimizers here at Vine Skills. I help run the free help sessions as well as get folks in and implemented into Filevine and FVDA. And then I'll let Stephanie introduce herself and then take it away.
So I'm Stephanie, and I also do kind of a bunch of things for Vine Skills. Among them is automations. I also do implementations, optimizations, Periscope implementations, all that sort of stuff. So I'm hosting the Workato session today, even though I am not the most experienced automations person on my team. And part of the reason for that is, at least in my experience, the biggest disconnect, the biggest barrier to setting up automations that are useful for firms is that from a strictly technical perspective, automation engineers don't necessarily understand why firms do what they do and how they do it, kind of the wacky workflows firms have. And firms don't understand the technical language that the automation engineers use. So it can take a lot of tries sometimes to get an automation that not only works from a technical perspective, but actually works for the firm. So because I have legal experience and also automation experience, I thought it would be great to have a conversation about how, from a firm perspective, you can help bridge that gap and make your time with an automation engineer more productive. And we'll also go into kind of the basics of automations so that if your goal is to be able to set some of those up yourself, you will have the tools to do that. So I want to start with, give me a minute here. I'm going to share my screen because I have notes. I don't have a fancy PowerPoint. So we're not that fancy here.
No worries. And as Stephanie is going through, if you all have questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A and we'll get those answered for you in real time.
Absolutely. Everybody, Jasmine, can you see my screen here? My Word document, Google document?
Yes.
Awesome, fantastic. So I guess the most basic question is, what is an automation? By definition, an automation is anything that automates a process, makes it less manual. Filevine has the ability to automate a number of things without the need for a third-party solution like Workato. DocGen, you can automate document jet creation by setting up your DocGen forms. You can automate task assignment and deadline calendaring using the task flows phase-based or task flow buttons for tasks, or the deadline chains for deadlines. So I highly recommend, if you're looking to automate those sorts of things, that you first explore Filevine's built-in automation features before resorting to use of a third-party product to automate things such as Workato or Zapier. So I'm going to speak about Workato because that is what Filevine sells. Workato is only one of many automation solutions that you can use to automate things in Filevine. And Workato is essentially a no-code or low-code solution. So any Joe Schmo like me, paralegal, educator actually by degree, and paralegal by trade, can learn how to automate things without having to take classes or become a developer. So the first question to ask is, what can I automate, or can I automate it? You can't just automate anything in Filevine. In Filevine, Workato can automate anything that a user can do manually. So if there is something that you want to do in Filevine that you can't do in Filevine yourself as an org admin, Workato is not going to be able to automate that for you. The Workato has what's called a Filevine integration user that connects it to Filevine, or connects Filevine to Filevine itself. And that integration user has org admin privileges. So they don't have any, it doesn't have any privileges beyond what you have. If you can't do it manually, Workato is not going to be able to automate that. So something else to consider is what options are available for automating within Filevine. And Filevine does have an API document website. And is there some place I can drop that link here in the chat, Jasmine, if they see it?
Yep, in the chat. You'll have to make sure that you do to everyone.
So I'm going to drop that link there. This may not make a lot of sense to you from a lay perspective, but basically what you want to look at down here is your subscriptions and the different things you can do. So basically, you can unassign a task, you can create a task, you can update a task, and same thing with project team, collection sections, forms. It gives you the basics of what is open to what's called the API, Application Programming Interface. It's the public face of what Filevine allows a third-party integration to do within Filevine. Okay. All right. So if we've determined that we can automate it, the question is, should we automate it? And the reason I ask that is because there are some things that from a very technical perspective are possible, but we really don't recommend it. And the biggest question that you should ask yourself is what happens if this automation fails? And automations do fail for a number of reasons. Sometimes there's user error, and sometimes the API fails, and that has to do with the amount of traffic that it's seen. So a good rule of thumb is to consider the consequences if an automation fails. Is this something where you're going to be missing a very important deadline? Is this something that would be causing you to commit the M word that no one likes to speak of, but malpractice? Consider all of these things before deciding whether or not you want to automate it. And honestly, as a general rule of thumb, the more complicated an automation is, the more likely it is to fail. It's really not any different in any sort of like medical procedure issue. The more interventions you have, the more likely you're going to need another intervention, right? Okay, so once we've decided in the planning process that we can automate it and we should automate it, and that for the most part is going to be the things like the things that you're going to want to automate are the things that your users are spending extra clicks on. So some examples would be when the phase changes, if you want to toggle on or toggle off certain sections. Great example of that from a personal injury perspective would be litigation. In the pre-lit phase, you don't need your writ discovery, your pleadings, your motions, those sections. But when you move into litigation, you do need those. So Workato can be used to toggle on those litigation sections when the phase is changed to litigation. That way, they're not cluttering up your menu when you're in pre-lit. They're available for your lit people. Another great example would be for mass tort. Toggling on sections specific to the campaign based on the selection in either the intake or the case summary, what type of campaign it is. You can have specific sections for each mass tort campaign built out that are toggled on based on the selection in that field, whatever case type dropdown you have there. Okay. So once we've decided what we're going to automate to save our users those extra clicks, nothing that's going to require an analysis. We don't want a robot essentially analyzing for us, but anything that staff is spending extra clicks on. Once we've made that decision, now we need to start planning, make a plan for our automation. And at Vine Skills, and Filevine actually uses this as well, a slightly different version, we use what's called an automation tracker. And this, either using something like this with your automation engineer or something similar, considering the data points that we're looking at here, is going to really help save time and make the automation process more efficient. All right, so I'm going to come in. This is our sandbox, and this is our basic automation tracker. Oops, here. We've decided what we want to automate. Now we need to be able to communicate to our automation engineer how that automation is going to work. Remember that a lot of these automation engineers, they're experts in the API, RESTful API, all these words that I don't actually know what they mean. That's what they are experts in. They are not experts in any particular law type or law in general. They're not experts in firms and how firms work and the processes you use. So you're going to need to be very specific and as detailed as possible. It's really easy to say, I want for when I have a companion case, when I update insurance, I want it to be updated in the other plaintiff cases. I understand that from a legal perspective. But a lot of the automation engineers aren't going to understand that. They're not going to understand what should trigger the automation. They're not going to understand which fields you want to be mirrored over. So we use this to kind of help bridge that gap with our clients. I may give my clients access to this so they can come in and create their own requests. And for the clients that don't do that, I basically fill it out for them. And as I'm filling out the form, I use these various fields to make sure I'm getting clarification from them so that I'm setting up exactly what they want. So it not only works from a technical perspective, but also from the law firm's perspective, it's useful to the law firm. So short description, just kind of what it is you're looking to do. And then this is more of a status here. So this is for me tracking if whether or not it's just been submitted. I haven't started it yet. If it's in progress, if the automation is live and turned on for all projects in the firm's org, or if it's declined. And there are some things that we do decline, and those things fall under the scenario of perhaps either it can't be automated because there's not an endpoint available, API endpoint available, or it shouldn't be automated. Probably from a technical perspective, it may be possible, but we don't recommend it. And then a priority. And this helps us, work through, especially for firms some firms don't really know what they want to do with Workato yet, but some firms have a laundry list. So picking a priority helps us set our priorities on what we should work on. Then we need to know the project type or template. If you have multiple templates, we need to know the type, the template or templates that this automation should be set up in. Impacted sections. So a great example would be wanting to automate or mirror data from the intake into a collection section, for example. Perhaps your personal injury and you have taken in the intake section, you've taken the initial medical providers, the EMS, the ambulance company, the emergency room, and you want a medical collection item created for each of those contacts in intake. So you would mark here, intake, and then whatever your medical section is called. And so that lets us know which sections we're taking information from and what section we're putting that information into for that type of automation. If it were a phase change automation, when I change to the litigation phase, I want to toggle on certain sections. You would list the sections that you want toggled on here in this field. And then impacted fields. And honestly, this is the part that firms hate filling out the most, but it is the most important part for your automation engineer because we don't know which fields you want copied over. If you have an automation set up where you've created, the main project for your lead plaintiff, but you want to create additional projects for other plaintiffs you represent in connection with the same case, and you want to mirror some of the data over, you need to let us know which data points you want to mirror over. Obviously, the date of incident I can guess, the case type I can guess, description of accident I can guess, but anything else that you want mirrored over into the additional projects, you'll need to list the fields out here, and it's time consuming and it's a pain in the butt. And a lot of firms, because what you do so well, think this is obvious. I'm just going to say all intake, all appropriate intake fields. It's not that obvious to an automation engineer, or even someone like me who my primary experience is in workers' compensation. I have gotten PI experience, but it's still not what I did for 15 years. So if you could help us out by being specific, and then a general description of what you want the automation to do. And a lot of times in the testing process, we have to make adjustments to the automation after the fact because either the impacted fields weren't all listed initially, or the general description wasn't fully accurate. You missed a step, you left it out. So come in and put a general description of the accident here, and then we click submit. And then from there, this is kind of what we fill out, what type of automation it is. Are we just mirroring data from one field to another, from a static section to another static section, from static to collection, all that sort of stuff. And then it's really important to think about your trigger. When is this automation going to run? How do you want it to be triggered? There are a number of triggers in Filevine. Some of them are smarter and safer than others. So for example, an action button. An action button is a tactile button that instead of attaching a task to, we attach to, it becomes your automation trigger. We put in a taskable button. We tell Workato that when someone clicks this button, we want you to take these steps. The great thing about an action button trigger is that it triggers exactly when you want it to, when you click that button. Other options are on create. It triggers once when the collection item is created. Phase change, when you change the phase, it will trigger once when you change the phase to that either specific phase or any phase. Like, so if you wanted to add a billing item, every time the phase is changed to whatever phase it gets changed to for review of the file, for appropriateness of changing the phase, whatever you may bill it as. Triggers that are available, but we don't recommend, and I'll get into that for a moment, in just a moment, are when an item is saved. So when a static form is saved, and when a collection item is saved. And the reason for that is that automation is going to run every time you click save. The automation doesn't know what you've updated in that section. So every time you hit save, it's going to run, and it may or may not take action, depending on what the steps in the recipe are. So you're using what are called tasks in Workato, and that task level, especially if it's a section that you're in and updating a lot, but the automation only needs to do something maybe 1% of the time, it's going to be running every single time. And that's a similar situation with any sort of activity automation in the activity section. You can run automation based on activity coming into or happening in the activity section, but that automation is going to run every time something happens in the activity section, which in some cases is a lot. So it's something to consider, especially if you are on a pricing model with Filevine, where you are being your charges are based on the number of tasks you're using. You're going to want to stick to an action button or on create in most cases. Okay. So now that we've discussed the automation sections and the trigger, let's talk about actually setting up a basic automation. And I'll open that up to anybody here if anyone has a suggestion. If not, then I'll just do a basic intake to collection section automation. And I'm putting myself on the spot here because you may suggest something that I'm simply not capable of, but I'll let you know.
And feel free to use that Q&A feature to drop that in, or the chat.
I'll just give it a couple seconds. Okay, so I'm just going to go with my scenario of a personal injury intake where we have contact field, person fields for the initial providers, and we want to create a collection item in the medical section for one of those providers. So I'm going to, I don't have a medical section turned on here, so let me turn that on. That's an important point, actually. Workato, if the section is hidden, Workato can't push in information to it. It's kind of similar to the reporting limitations, where if the section is hidden, it's not going to pull into a report. So the exception to that is it will be able to toggle it on, but if it's not on, it's not going to be able to push data into it. So I've toggled on my medical section here. And let's come down to my was EMS ambulance called EMS company. So the goal of this automation is going to be to take the contact here and create a medical item for that on trigger. So All right. So we have our contact here. Let's start with our automation. If anyone's ever logged into Workato, if you have access to Workato, when you first log in, you're going to see your initial for your user here. So I'm logged in as me, but I need, you will have, and this is the way Filevine sets it up, you'll have your user account, and then you'll have access to your firm account. So if you click on that icon and go to your firm account, then you'll see, so this is where all of our automations are set up. I don't have any set up in my personal account. And the first thing I would recommend is having some sort of organizational system so that when you come back in here, you are able to locate your automations easily. You're not just scrolling through a list of them. I like to create folders. So here's my folder here. And then within my folder, I have a folder for each section where I have automation set up. So if I have an automation that's triggering from the intake section, I'm going to save that automation, create it, and save it into the intake folder. You can create additional folders by clicking where if you want it to be, you can create a project, that's going to be your main folder. And then within your projects, you can create a subfolder by clicking the plus once you're in the project there, give it a folder name, and it will be saved into your subfolder. So I'm going to start an intake. And for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to start from scratch on automation. You can duplicate automations, existing automations, if what you're looking to set up is similar to something you've done previously, and you just need to change a couple of the data pills. This is to teach you how to do it. So we're going to start from scratch. I'm going to go to create, and I'm going to go to recipe. And then we're going to start with a name. Again, the name is going to help you organize and be able to easily locate your automations. So you're going to want to name it something that's very clear and specific. I like to start with the section where it's located. And then I like to add kind of a general description if it's what it's going to do. So we'll do create med item for EMS. And then the last thing I like to do is put what is going to trigger it. So we're going to be using a task flow trigger button that we're going to put in together. And I'm going to put that right here. So it's going to be on trigger of create med item. Okay, and then we're going to call that task flow trigger create med item. The next thing we need to decide is if we are triggering for an app, running on schedule, triggering from a webhook. Honestly, most of the time you're going to be using trigger from an app. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to be triggering from within Filevine. So we're triggering from an app. The action we're taking that's triggering the automation is going to happen in Filevine. So from here, you're going to pick your connections. I have a number of applications connected here. You will probably only have one, and that will look, it will say Filevine. The icon may look different. It just depends on when your connection was set up and how it was set up. Oops, I think I picked my wrong trigger or my wrong connection. This is the pick connection. Hold on just a minute. I've got too many things in here. There we go. Okay, so once we've picked our connection, we're going to pick our object type, and this is your trigger. When it's asking you for object type, you're going to pick your trigger object, and we're going to use task flow. And we're going to trigger the automation when the task flow is executed. But now we need to set some trigger conditions. We don't want this recipe to run every time any task flow button in our environment is clicked. We need to tell Workato under what specific circumstances we want this recipe to run. So we're going to set trigger conditions. And this is really important because it'll save you on tasks. But especially during the testing process, you want to limit your automation to one project for testing. So then if you're not setting automations live in your org on all cases, and people are clicking buttons, wreaking havoc on their cases before an automation has been properly tested and is ready to be live. So we're going to start with our trigger data here. We are going to start with our project type ID. And I have my project type IDs actually saved already into environment properties. This is a step you could probably actually skip because you're going to also be putting your section selector and field selector in there, and that section selector is going to be unique to that project type, and so is the field selector. So I'm also going to add here section selector. So I want this automation to trigger when my template type is my workers' comp Florida project, a little personal playground. And when the section equals, for this, you're going to need access to the customs editor. And you're going to want to come in here. So this is the section where this we're going to be putting that task flow trigger. So we're going to pick the section selector or this section. So when the section equals intake 1, and this is important, and I will be the first to admit that I have forgotten this more than once, and then anytime someone clicks a button in the intake, this automation runs. Field selector, you need to tell Workato specifically what task flow button within the intake should trigger this automation. So let's go create that together. We're going to come in here, we're going to find our EMS ambulance, and down here somewhere. There we go. So we have where they called, company, yes, no, and we're going to add this at 93.4 here. So we'll add a task flow button, action button, task flow trigger, and we're going to call it create med item. 3 and 4, and we're going to, I'm not going to worry about hiding it. Okay, so now that we have our task flow trigger here, we are going to copy the field selector or the widget selector, and we are going to say when the field selector equals, okay, and then you want to exclude your integration user from being able to trigger this automation. So I briefly mentioned integration user initially, and I want to show you actually what that looks like. So you may have at some point been in your team section and you see these extra users, Filevine integration, lead docket integration, and you probably wonder, well, what is that, right? Like, who is that? So that is the user, your integration user that your Workato is using to automate these actions. You should never remove the Filevine integration user from any of your environments, and you should never change the permissions for the integration user in any of your environments. Doing so will basically break whatever integrations or automations are set up with using that user, okay? So Filevine integration user has its own specific user ID. I'm going to say, and the user ID does not equal my API user. And then the last thing we're going to do is we are going to limit this recipe so that it's live only in our test project, so that we're not confusing our users with automated actions that they weren't expecting until it's been announced. You're going to copy your project ID, and you are going to come here. So in your step 1 in our monitor object, the project ID where this button was clicked, we want it to only run when the project ID equals the 1 for our test project. Thank you. So I exclude the API user because we only want our users triggering this automation. We don't want the API user to be able to trigger it itself, especially where you're creating collection items. It could create an endless loop. So you would click a button once or change the face once or whatever it does to trigger the automation, but the automation could continue under certain circumstances running indefinitely. So all of a sudden where you expected 1 item, you have 10,000. So you're going to want to exclude that API user to avoid that scenario. Okay. So now that I have all of my steps set up in the trigger step, we are going to, and a lot of what I'm going to be showing you here, the setting up of the recipe itself, once you get the hang of it, is actually quite simple. The most important part of the process is testing, is planning, testing, and then documentation. So we want so that anyone who comes in here is going to, we want our automations to be safe, to be thoughtful, to be safe, and we want them to be well documented so that anyone who comes in here can see what an automation is doing and see what the various steps are that it's taking, okay? So we're gonna set up an error handling step here. And that basically means you're gonna tell Filevine or Workato what to do if there's an error. And API errors happen. Sometimes there's a 504 error, which basically means that the request is timed out. There's slowness in the environment. It causes the request to time out. So you can tell Workato what to do when something like that happens. Do you care? If you do care, do you want to be notified? Or is someone going to be constantly monitoring your Workato environment so they'll see it? A lot of times, we think we get our automation set up at Workato. It's kind of like a set it and forget it thing. But we need to be, so we're not looking at it constantly. We need to be aware when something errors out. So we're going to start basically by telling it to monitor, and we'll set up what we do on error at the end. So what we're going to do here now is we are going to, we've set up our trigger step, and we've told Workato when this happens in Filevine, we want to do something. But what do we want to do? So let's tell our recipe now what steps we want it to take. And it's going to be sequential because each step that you take is going to gather data, or what's called data pills, for Workato to use. So if you get to a step and you can't find the data pill you need, it's because you missed a step. So the first step in most cases is going to be to get the project. Let's get the information for the project that this button was clicked in, basically. So you can scroll to see, and when I showed you the API documentation before, these are the things that are available to you. This is actually a lot more user-friendly or easier to understand. So if you have access to your Workato environment, rather than going to the documentation, you can scroll through here to see what your options are, what Filevine is going to allow you to automate using Workato. So we're going to get project. Which means we're going to get the project details with using the project ID in Filevine. And then this star indicates that you need to put a data pill in here. And when you click here, Workato is going to suggest to you options for data pills. So the only step that we have data in so far is this object, the monitor object. When you click the button, Workato gathers certain data. Primarily, it gathers which case you're in, which project you're in when you click the button. And that's going to be your project ID here. So I want to get additional information regarding the project where this button was clicked. And then I highly recommend that you add comments. I understand what the general description here means, but for people who may be less savvy about the language being used, you can add an additional description. So, and this is part of the documentation process. So get project information, project aware create was clicked. And the nice thing is, if you are setting up these comments as you go, you can actually print a screenshot of this recipe when it's done, and it shows you the exact workflow of the automation. So if your users are asking, well, when does this trigger and what does it do, you can actually give them a copy of it. So now that I have the information from the project where the automation was triggered, I need to get the information for the EMS, right, the ambulance. And where does that live? It lives in the intake. So now that I have the information from the project, which means it will see which sections are available, I need to now get the information from the intake. So I'm going to add a step, and I'm going to choose action and app, and I'm going to go back to my Filevine app. And now I want to get information from that static section. And a static section, Workato refers to it as a form. So we're going to say get form. And you'll see here we have a couple of required fields. Project type, you can actually choose from the drop down list here. So this is the project type that we're in. And if you give it a minute, it will load the sections available within that project type. So I am in my intake personal injury. And then I need to tell it again which project I want to get this information for. It's the project where the button was clicked. So I'm going to, instead of choosing from a list, because this button is going to be clicked in a variety of projects across your environment. So you're not going to want to select from just like one drop down for the project. You're going to want to use the project ID here. So no matter what project this button's clicked in, Workato knows what intake to get. So we're going to go back up to our trigger step here, and we're going to pick that project ID here. So now I've gotten the information from the intake, and I need to create that medical item. So I'm going to add another. Let me add my comment here. Look at me being sloppy about my automation. Get information from intake. And I'm going to add an action. I'm going to add a step, and I'm going to, now I want to create that medical item. And if you had, for example, forgotten to get the details from the form, when you got to this item, this step where you want to create your medical item, you'd know you'd forgotten something because you wouldn't have the data that you needed to populate. So let's create a collection item, and it's right here. And we got to tell it again what the project type is and what section we want to create that item in. And once we do that, there will be additional fields that appear that we can populate. So we're going to do my workers' comp template. And we want to create meds PI. That's the one I turned on. And right now what it's doing is searching for the fields that are available within that meds PI section. So again, I got to tell it which project. We're going to go back to step 1. And we're going to give it that same project ID. And now we have to decide what data points we want to populate. So if we're in our medical section here, we'll look at the fields from the front end. You'll see that we have a provider contact. And that's probably all the information that we are going to be able to populate from the intake. Now, if you also had a provider dropdown type here that contained ambulance as a type, you could populate that. If you, in your intake, had a date field for the date they took the ambulance, which obviously in most cases is going to be the date of incident, but not necessarily, or the date they showed up at FDR, then you could mirror that data over as well. But in order to mirror data, the data has to live in the intake, and you have to have a corresponding option in the medical section. And that's part of why it's so important to think about the fields, exactly which data points you want mirrored, because you may need to add some fields in order to make your automation work. So what I want to do is I want to take the person field in the intake, and I want to mirror that contact to provider. I'm not worried about anything else. I just want to save my team the trouble of having to add it to the intake and then come again and add it again here. So I'm going to go to provider, and I'm going to go to ID. So this is what the contact looks like in Workato. The actual contact card itself, you're going to look for the ID field here. And that's all I have. So I'm going to apply changes. I'm just going to save. Oops, sorry, that too soon. So it is best practice to kind of save as you go, just in case you have some sort of internet failure. You don't want to, I have unfortunately been on the receiving end of doing a lot of work and then having to go redo it because something happened and I hadn't kind of saved as I went. So if we come here, now we have the provider ID available, but we need to tell Workato what information to put in there. So it says Vine Skills because we actually have a couple of connections within Sandbox. So we've named our connection specifically so we know which environment or which org we're connecting to. We have a couple different Filevine orgs where we're not just connecting our Filevine org to our Filevine org, we're connecting our Filevine org to something else. So we've gone ahead and labeled that as Vine Skills. So what I need to do is I need to find the, yes, it will have the same option. I need to find the contact for the ambulance so that I can create it in the med section. And if you'll recall, I got that information in step 4 when I got the information from the intake. So what I'm going to do, didn't mean to click there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to, as I'm clicking in here, I'm going to go back to step 4. I'm going to make sure I'm in step 4. And then I need to find the field in the intake. And I do a lot of copying and pasting. It's just easier to do it that way. So EMF company, I put that here. My connection is slow today. It's going to take me right to that EMS company. And the data fields that I have available here are the ID. So ID, that's the one I want. But I could also grab the full name, first name, last name. I could grab the nickname, all of those basic fields that are available. I had not saved. All of those basic fields that are available on this first page of the contact card are going to be available for you as part of, as one of the options here. So what I want to do is use the ID. And that's it. So in theory, when we run this, it's going to create a collection item for the test ambulance company in the med section. Last step, though, is that we need to select, we need to set up our error handling stuff. And you must do this. You must do this because there is a person at Filevine who receives error messages if you don't. So if you don't have an error handling step, you are going to be spamming her with error messages, and she will reach out to you to let you know you are spamming her and to ask you to please set up your error handling step properly. So there's a number of options to set up error handling step. If you really don't care if this fails or not, because you have a report that is going to be your redundancy feature, whatever it may be, you can just log it. Now there are other options. I recommend going a step further than that. So I have, I'm going to call another recipe. An error handling recipe, you can set up an error handling recipe as its own recipe and call on it that when an error happens, it then starts that recipe and runs that recipe. So we have a couple in here. I'm just going to grab error handling here, and I'm going to fill out these data pills. So step 6 is on error, and Workato collects certain information when an error happens. So select the type. I'm going to just populate these error message. And now the recipe name. So these are part of the properties here. So if we come up to properties, we'll see the recipe name. We're going to populate there. We'll see the job number. It's going to be our job ID. And then the project affected, that's your project ID in step 1. Or if you actually want to see the name of the project, you can go to step 2 where you've got the project. And your project name is going to be here, or your client name. So we'll use this one here. There we go. Now that will log the error. Now, if you want to be notified of the error because someone's not in file in Workato constantly monitoring this, you're going to want to set up an email step. And so you'll see that these are all Workato applications. So the error handling, email, these are Workato applications. Workato has its own applications that you can use to support your automations within Filevine. You're going to need to designate an email. Give it a subject, and what I usually do is say ISA error, and then I'll put automation error, and then I'll put the name of the recipe. And the purpose of that is if you're getting a lot of errors, if there is an API issue going on and a lot of things are timing out because there's slowness in the environment, you may be getting a number of errors from different recipes. So you want the email to tell you as much information as possible so you know which one to go look at. If it's a timeout error, there's really nothing you can do but rerun it. But if it's erroring out for some other reason, you need to take a closer look at that recipe, at the ones that have failed, to find out what's going wrong. And then you can put a message. And I typically like to put exactly what was in my error handling. So I'll put error type, I'll put error message, save. So now we're ready for testing. So you can turn an automation on live, or you can test it, which is basically you run it, you trigger it once, and then it stops running. Testing is, I highly recommend that you do the test recipe before you turn it on, because then if you have a trigger issue and your recipe is not triggering at all, you'll know when you go to test it. So we'll click test recipe here. Then we're going to go. There we go. Okay, so we're going to go into our intake here, and let me refresh because I had added that button. So I need to refresh to see it. I'm going to create my med item. I'm going to start that task flow. And if all goes well on live demonstration, it will work. So trigger found. We're on the right track. If this just says testing, 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 and you never see trigger found, and it's just thinking, that means there's something wrong with your trigger step. You go back to step one and you ask yourself, okay, did I put the data in wrong? Did I, sometimes if your key's still in the old API portal, not all of the subscriptions are turned on. So Workato doesn't even know it's allowed to automate this item. You have to go turn on a subscription. All right, so we see successful right there. That does not necessarily mean that the automation, the recipe did what we asked it to do in Filevine. So let's go check Filevine. We come here and we go to medical. We will see success. Our item was created with our provider populated. Again, if we had had additional data points from the intake we wanted to create, we could have done that, but we didn't have any for this particular scenario. And I want to take you back here to, so we're under a test job right now, and I want to take you through kind of what you see on the back end when you click on each step. So when you click on each step, Filevine is going to tell you the data that goes in to the step, and it's going to tell you what comes out. And when your recipes are going sideways, when they're not working, where something's wrong, it's not populating, check your output. That will tell you, so if you have a step where it's supposed to enter this, check the step before to see if the output contained the value you wanted to enter in that step. That a lot of my troubleshooting happens there. So an example of that would be, I want to create the collection item. And in the collection item, I want to input the provider. So this is the provider I wanted to input. Did that provider exist? Was that value populated in the prior step? So if we go to the prior step, which is where we're getting information from the intake, you'll see a list. The output shows every field available in the intake here. And where that field did not have information, you'll see null. So if you come in here and you see, and this goes in the order I think that they were added, not necessarily the order that they're listed. So it is in here somewhere because obviously we found it. But if you come here and you see that that value is here, it's because that's why your next step isn't working. Okay. All right. So a couple of housekeeping things, and this is so important, and I wish I'd not spoken so much and had more time to spend on it. Back to the documentation. After you've tested this, so you've tested it in your test case, it's worked. Seriously consider every scenario under which this recipe is going to run. Test each scenario. Test one where we wanted to deliberately fail. You know your workflows better than your automation engineer. We can't anticipate all of the ways that firms are in Filevine, all the ways they're touching sections, and sometimes we see unintended consequences for that. So from a firm perspective, test it thoroughly. Once you're ready to turn it on live, you're going to come back and you're going to remove that project ID, because right now this automation is only running in that test project. We're going to remove the test project ID. We're going to save and exit, and we're going to hit start recipe. Okay. When you turn a new automation on, notify your users, explain to them what they should expect, and ask them to watch, to double check. The first couple of times you trigger an automation, the first week, the first month you trigger an automation, just double check to make sure that it's working as expected and you're not seeing any unintended consequences. Too often we set it and forget it because it worked once, and then maybe 6 weeks down the road, we're like, there's this weird thing happening in our Filevine environment. Why is that? And we realized it was because our automation had an unintended consequence, but we have 6 weeks of wacky stuff happening that we've now got to go clean up and fix. So keep an eye on them, test them thoroughly, keep an eye on them once they're live, and have users report unexpected behavior to you. So back to documentation, just a couple of best practices. If you make any changes to your fields here, if you remove this field, if you obsolete it, the field connected to automation, your automation is going to break. So you should note each field that is connected to this automation so that anyone who does have admin access to your customs editor knows that this field's being used in an automation and they don't mess with it without first checking to make sure that whatever they're doing isn't going to impact your automation. So I would come to that person field here and I would put in the internal notes, you just write automation field, right? You can write the name of the recipe it's being used in. You can put as much information as you want, but you absolutely need to note the field somehow that this is being used. And then the same thing for the trigger itself. A great practice is also to add a note to the section itself, the internal note for the section. That there's automations in a section. And then the last thing you're going to want to do, if you have an automation tracker, is to come back in here, and if you added a field for the automation that wasn't listed here, add it to the list. If you need a more technical description, make sure that you note that here, because it's a collection section in Filevine. You could set up a collection export. So if you ever needed documentation of all of the automations running in your environment, what sections they're automating, what fields within each section they're automating, how they're triggered, and what the actual workflow is that should be expected out of them, you could come in and you can just run a collection export of all automations where the status is live. And that will save you so much time in the future if the person who set this up has gone and now something's going wrong, or you want to make an adjustment, you need to do it. It'll save you a ton of time. And as you can see, the actual recipe setup itself took very little time. The rest of it is actually what takes a ton of time, the thought process and the planning, and then the documentation and noting of all the appropriate places just to make sure that it's clear what's happening. And that's it. That's all I got. I didn't leave much time for questions, but did anybody have any questions?
Thanks so much, Stephanie. That was so informative. Hopefully folks got some good content from there. If you do have questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. We'll be back next week with free help. It's open forum, ask me anything. So feel free to pop into that. We also offer services. So these automation services, if you're like, that was way too complicated over my head, or I get it, but I just don't have the time to do it. You can always retain Vine Skills services for us to build out some of those automations. If you're wanting your Filevine to be optimized, or if you haven't got into Filevine yet and you're looking to launch, again, you can retain our services. We also do training services as well. I can drop our webpage in the chat for you all, just so that you have access if you did want to look at any of our services. And then also check out, the rest of our learning. We do have some additional videos up on our website if you guys are ever looking to, again, get some more content on a variety of topics within Filevine and other places as well. But we'll maybe hang for a few more minutes just to see if there's any questions that come through, and I will go ahead and put our website in that chat for you all. And I'll also leave my email address as well as Stephanie's. If you all have any questions or again want to engage our services, you can reach out to us and we can get you guys started. Okay. It looks like there's no questions, but again, if anything comes up after this, feel free to reach out. We hope you all have a great rest of your week. Have a safe holiday weekend. And thanks so much, Stephanie.
Oh, thanks, Jasmine, for facilitating.
Of course. Have a good one.